Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Audit and Governance Committee, the first one in this new municipal year. I'd like to start with the usual note. So this is a public meeting and members of the public and press are permitted to report on the proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photographing, making an audio recording and providing commentary on the proceedings. Please note that this meeting is recorded and streamed live. These recordings are published on the relevant meeting pages of the Council website. By choosing to attend this public meeting, you are deemed, therefore, to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. Do not spend time collecting your personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed. Once you have left the building, the assembly point is in the High Street opposite the Guildhall. Members and other speakers are reminded to use their microphone when speaking. So with this official bit done, I'd like to say a warm welcome to all the committee members. I think if my memory serves me right, it's just myself and Councillor Lamb who are returning from last year, but everybody else is new to this committee, so a very warm welcome to everybody. Do we have any apologies?
Yes, Chair, we have apologies from Councillor Amos and we have no substitutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on to agenda item number 2, declarations of interest. Any interest to declare? Anyone? Very well. And agenda item number 3, public participation. Do we have anybody? I don't see anyone unless
there is none, Chair. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So in this case, I would like to invite members to have a look at the meeting, at the minutes of the meeting, which took place in March. Shall we take them page by page, starting with page number 1? Anything to note there? Moving on to page 2, 3, and finally 4. Myself and Councillor Lamb were there, and I don't think I've got anything else to add. So in this case, I'd like to confirm that the minutes presenting to this meeting are an accurate representation of what happened in March in this committee. Right. So I propose to move to agenda number 5. And so this is our annual governance statement for the last year. This is something that we are. It's a very detailed report. I hope you members spend time going through it with some with care. This will be for approval, but if there are any questions towards the end of it, would you be happy to take questions during your introduction, Shan? Okay. So if I can ask our monitoring officer to.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as the Chair says, we are required to publish an annual governance statement, which is a look back at the Council's governance arrangements in the preceding year. In this case, the preceding year ending when we got to the next set of elections, so our preceding municipal year. And it's a look back at the effectiveness of our governance. And also we are asked to look forward and identify what we think our governance challenges will be for the year ahead. So there are a number of ways in which you can produce an annual governance statement. The approach we've taken in Worcester for the last few years is to organise our statement against the CIPFA principles of good governance, which are set out in our local government code, CIPFA being the Chartered Institute of Public Finance Accountants. So we're using the CIPFA framework, which gives these principles, which CIPFA say drive good governance. And then we've also decided to take a narrative approach to the report. So we provide evidence and arguments as to why we have effective governance. And the reason I say that is the approach a few years ago was to sort of just itemize the policies that we have. as opposed to trying to describe the activities that we do, make the document a bit more active and dynamic, and to try and describe what outcomes they have achieved. So that's the overall approach. The format follows that we've taken in the last couple of years, laid out in the same way. I'm going to just mention some of the key points in the paragraphs. Overall, officers' assessment, and obviously it's for the committee to decide if they support that. Overall, officers' assessment is that the performance in governance terms is positive. And we provide evidence as to why that's the case. It's good to have a year of the annual governance statement where we're not reporting back on the impact of COVID. It's good to put that behind us in terms of how we've operated. However, it is of ongoing significant concern to the council that we cannot offer an external audit opinion relating to this year that we're talking about, the previous financial year, or indeed this one. So that is a matter of concern, and no doubt Shane can speak further about that if he wishes later, but the committee will remember that that's something we've talked and challenged ourselves about before, but it's effectively outside of the council's control. A new matter is proposed for consideration in the annual governance statement this year, and that relates to councillor attendance at meetings. It's been proposed to me by several members that could feature in our annual governance statement as an indicator of our commitment to good governance. A number of local authorities do routinely publish on their websites statistics showing attendance by councillors at committee meetings. A number don't, but as I say, if you do a search for yourself, you'll see that a good number do. Some reporting on council's websites, which I think is favourable, has a degree of nuance, which recognises when councillors substitute for each other, you know, when they've given apologies and things like that. And I think that's a good way to report rather than just a blanket spreadsheet. I'm just going to go into the document itself and walk through the individual headings if you're happy for me to do that. Yeah. So as I say, the first couple of sections of the document are the preamble that explain how the principles around good governance are organised in the SIP for Code. And then this year's activity really starts at section 3. Then we go in section 3 to look at these different principles. So for example, behaving with integrity, demonstrating strong commitment, respecting the rule of law. And we work through those different principles and provide evidence of what we've done in this particular year. So we note that this year we've reviewed a number of our policies and sections of our constitution, as we try and do every year. The Standards Committee similarly has reviewed its procedures and a new code of conduct has been adopted. There were no adverse findings made against the local authority for this year by the local government ombudsman. But in this section where we're talking about compliance and high standards, we must recognise that the council in this year had a significant service failure through one of its contracted suppliers. And it won't surprise anybody here to know that I'm talking about the car parking machines. So we report on that in this annual governance statement, and we reference the fact that that had a very distressing impact on thousands of council customers and has resulted in the council giving notice to terminate the contract, appointing a new supplier and seeking recovery of financial losses from the outgoing supplier. And I think it would be remiss of the annual governance statement not to reflect that significant contractual dispute. Similarly, we are the recipients of a legal action, and that relates to a judicial review application brought by the Worcestershire Acute Hospital Trust in relation to a planning decision. And that should be seen in the context of a national debate about the government's model for providing NHS funding to respond to increased development brought through planning applications, and the legal question of how that sits against local authorities' obligations through the planning service to deliver other forms of infrastructure, including affordable housing. So there's a live legal case. It's going to be considered in the High Court within the next few weeks. That will limit how much I can say about that case tonight, but it clearly is a matter of interest for the annual governance statement. Moving forward, we talk about openness and stakeholder engagement. We talk about the fact that we've now got the first year of our new equality, diversity and inclusion strategy under our belt. And we also have the benefit of being able to look at the population demographic information that's coming through the 2021 census results. We talk about the fact that we've had the annual survey and that we achieved a response rate, which again is similar to previous years, just over 1,000 responses. And we provide some information there about satisfaction rates. I would note that the total report on the annual residence survey was reported to Policy and Resources Committee in February, and there's a lot more context in that report there. We move on to reference the fact that we've tried to be responsive in our work with stakeholders in terms of what we've talked about, having more annual conversations within the city. For example, our first sustainability strategy held in the Guildhall, and cost of living crisis symposium discussions, workshops, bringing together organisations and overseen by a task and finish group of members from all 4 groups. We were asked by the Arts Council to host a national event relating to the role of arts in place shaping and economic development, so we did that. We also had the benefit of reaching out to thousands of citizens through the Worcester Life Stories virtual time travel trail, and also many people attended the Arches Light Night Festival. We talk about our buildings and the accessibility of our buildings and the accessibility of our mayor in our civic events. Then also we talk about the fact that the Boundary Commission have continued to work with us on their periodic review of our boundaries, and that process is now drawing to a close with the final consultation outcomes expected to be published August, September time. Bear with me, Chair, I'm rattling through. The next one is around defining our outcomes in terms of sustainability, economic, social and environmental benefits. So we talk again, as we've done in previous years, about the specific external funding we've received to deliver capital investment into the city centre, or into the city generally. A little bit about the action we've been doing under the sustainability strategy. And obviously you'll recognise that in detail these actions are reported to the individual committees that sponsor them. We talked about the fact that we had over 3,000 responses to our consultation on the South Worcestershire Development Plan, which officers have been ploughing through and will be submitted for inspection later this year. And we talk about the fact that we tried to do something different with our approach to consultation this year, with our consultation on play, trying to aim our consultation at children, young people and their carers, and take forward the feedback to inform a new Worcester Play Plan. Then the next heading is determining the interventions that are necessary to optimise the achievement of the intended outcomes. So then again, directing our strategies to achieve our corporate goals. We've continued to deliver. We're in our 2nd year of our revised city plan, so we're working under that overall corporate plan. We do an annual State of the City review to assess progress against that plan. We continue to deliver our capital projects. We've put a new strategy in place for enabling affordable housing. We've put a new strategy in place in terms of Worcestershire Homelessness and Rough Sleeper Strategy and Action Plan, which is a refresh of previous iteration. We've reacted and responded to the government's requests in relation to resettlement of refugees, and we've been the recipient of funding to deliver accommodation units for those purposes and support the families resettling in our city. And I've mentioned the cost of living summits earlier. And then we have an action around developing the entity, the organisation's capacity and the capacity of leadership. So we talk a bit in there about how we still use staff surveys, staff conferences, tools, software tools and face-to-face tools to make sure that the workforce is truly connected to each other. We've tried to bolster our capacity on cyber resilience, because for anyone who's looked at the council's risk register, you will understand that that is one of the most significant risks facing the local authority. So we've put capacity in around that, and we've made sure that staff are trained in terms of cyber security vigilance. We've put some individuals forward for leadership development courses, including nationally, and we've tried to make sure that we have a good level of training and attendance at training courses. And I've referenced there a new policy that we have. So councillors proposed that we should have a parental leave policy for councillors to try and support those who may wish to step forward and be councillors and juggle their home commitments. So again, I think that's a good policy to add to our leadership offer. And that's the paragraph where I've added reference to levels of attendance at councillors at meetings. The overall level of attendance at formal meetings for the previous year was 89%, which is seems to me to be a very good measure. I haven't benchmarked it against others. Individual councillor records would sit on our website instead of obviously attached to a governance statement. And then finally, committee, you'll be pleased to know, I'm on the last section. So managing risk and performance, we are going to hear later from our internal auditors about their work programme. In relation to the external auditors' work, we are now lagging significantly behind. I think we're now 2 years behind, aren't we, Jane? Which is a very sorry state of affairs and not of the council's making. On the more positive side, we were able to set a balanced budget for the year that we've now entered. We are clearly focused this year on the financial challenges ahead of us, which have been contemplated for some time in the medium-term financial plan, and they're now upon us. So we talk in the document here about how we're going to be addressing those challenges. And then in terms of, sorry, I jumped ahead. In terms of audit, as I said, we're going to hear from internal audit. You've got a paper on your agenda later about some of the audit findings and support from audit in relation to external grant and a particular issue we've had on a particular grant. So we'll hear a little bit more about that later. And then, so I think just bringing to conclusion, I think it is probably obvious by the time you get to that point of the document what the challenges ahead of us are. It is quite clear that our financial future is very challenging, and that will affect many aspects of council service delivery. And having good governance around that is going to be really important. Having robust, transparent, informed decisions, being clear and communicating with our customers. Really taking a wide range of views into account, that's going to be essential. This is not a one-year challenge. Similarly, though, the council's ambition isn't affected by this, and we still have an awful lot of delivery planned under the city plan and the external grant funding, and we have an awful lot of delivery that we have to respond to where there's a new initiative from government, and we're required to be involved in grant giving and similar activities. So our governance needs to be robust to cope with all of those challenges. I think probably, Chair, that's probably all I need to say at this point. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Sian. This report explains pretty clearly to me, at least, that there's a vast amount of work going on right across the council, and a lot of this work is referenced here in this document. We talked about the sustainability strategy, EDI strategy as well. One of the suggestions in a discussion before the meeting today was perhaps to help with the ease of referring to those other streams of work. It might be useful to include some hyperlinks if possible, so that both colleagues and general public might go to the area which they have interest in. But otherwise, thank you very much. I'd like to invite questions, comments from the colleagues. Councillor Lamb.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Sian for a very detailed report. It was interesting reading. I just, under the point 2.6 about the attendance data issue, I'd like to support this. I think this is a really good idea, to be honest with you. And I know it originally came from members of the Standards Committee, and I wish I'd had the idea when I was Chair of Standards, but so I'm not going to pretend I came up with it, but I think it's a really great idea. And, you know, ultimately we are elected politicians, you know, our allowances are paid for by the council taxpayer, and we are accountable to the voter through elections which subsequently take place. And therefore the voters, I think, have a right to know how diligently we carry out our role. Now, this data, and as we've said, it's already used by other councils such as Wychavon. I had a look at their website and saw how they expressed it. It's an additional piece of information. Nobody's pretending it's the only piece of information that voters might take into account. You know, sometimes it's perfectly possible to turn up to a meeting and not say anything. It's perfectly possible to turn up to a meeting and talk a lot and not say anything of any significance, to be honest with you. So sometimes you're quite happy when people don't say things. But, you know, it is an additional piece of evidence which I think the voter has the right to know in the spirit of transparency about whether we turn up to meetings. And we all know that MPs already have their own. There are websites like They Work For You and publicwhip.com, which contain huge amounts of information on what MPs say, how often they turn up, how they vote. And so I think it's suitable to have this data published on the website, so we can sort of drill down to look at how individual members have turned up, etc. And I do have to say, you know, I've been surprised, disappointed actually, since the May elections about how many meetings I've been to. And I understand we've all got busy lives, we have got other commitments, I appreciate all that. But there's been a number of meetings I've been to where people have not turned up and they haven't even sent apologies. You know, they've been very conspicuous by their absence. I'm not going to name names because it'll be in the data. And I realise with smaller groups, it is sometimes difficult to find substitutes at short notice, but, you know, not even to send apologies. I personally don't think that's acceptable, and I think that will be exposed all the more by this kind of data. So I really, really welcome this development.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lamb. Just as a clarification, if I understand it correctly, and I'm turning here to our monitoring officer, in terms of following up on the attendance record, this would be a matter for the group leaders. Is that correct? That there's an expectation that members will meet a certain standard in terms of percentage of meetings attended?
Thank you, Chair. So the legislation sets out a minimum level of attendance, and my committee services colleagues keep their eye on that, and we track that, and we make sure that people have a reminder, because we're a team, and that's what we think is the right thing to do. So we've always done that. What would be published in the annual governance statement is just this overall percentage, because necessarily the annual governance statement is just the pulling together of amount of data. What would be published on our website would be the granular data of individual attendance. My proposal would be that it includes those additional fields of where people have given apologies or substituted, because I think people should be credited for substituting for others, because it's attendance at meetings. So, you know, that the totality of those data fields, I think, should be there. In terms of what might be done to encourage attendance, it would be a matter for group leaders to look at that data and talk to their colleagues about that. It wouldn't really be a function of my team to take that any further than reporting it and looking for the minimum level. That's where we think our role would stop.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a useful clarification. Anybody else? Any members have comments, suggestions, observation, or perhaps questions? Councillor Cookson, please.
First of all, I'd just like to echo that point. I think that would be very useful, and I think the way that Sean's proposed it, I'd be really happy with that level of understanding when people have substituted. I take it we're moving on from that issue. Do we need to do any more? Is that just going to go ahead now? So that's fine. I had a couple. First of all, thank you for such a comprehensive report, which meant it very hard for things to have lots of things to question, because you've covered it all. I had one question which I think you're going to say I can't tell you about, because I was going to ask you what the risk was to the Council of the Judicial Review, but I suspect there might be things you can't say at this stage.
Through you, Chair. Well, I'm happy to go as far as I can, and that is to say, we are recipients of judicial review action, the 3 South Worcestershire councils, because it relates to a planning consent that was granted some time ago, but it was still a live matter because it related to the terms of the Section 106 Planning Obligation Agreement. The risk of a court deciding that the decision that the 3 local authorities took was an unreasonable one is that the court says that decision doesn't stand. So, you know, the planning decision doesn't stand. So there's a number of interested parties, as you can imagine, including developer community and people with an interest in the site. So in practical terms, if the court was to decide that the councils had acted unreasonably, and the planning decision should be overturned, then that would call into question that application that was determined some time ago.
Does it create any sort of financial risk for the council?
Every time we are subject to judicial review, I would want to say it could definitely create a financial risk for the council. But because in a judicial review, it's the reasonableness of the decision that was taken, as you'll know, rather than the remedy around compensation, we were likely to be ordered to do something again and to do it again fresh. And of course, then you don't know what the ramifications are going to be, whether that's going to have cost implications or not.
When will we know, and where will it be reported to? Because clearly it's going to be hopefully resolved. Judicial reviews, it's hopefully going to be resolved within the next year, and you wouldn't want to, how's it going to get fed back to councillors what the outcome was when you actually know, given that we don't really want to wait for the annual statement next year?
Through you, Chair. Yes, I referred to it in my annual report to the planning committee a couple of weeks ago as well to make sure that it was because they'd had it reported to them sort of you know, as part of a briefing, but not on the record publicly. So I put it in our report there. So to cut a long story short, it's the planning committee who will be the first people to know on the record when that matter is determined, because it relates to an application determined by planning committee and the other planning committees some time ago. The other question, how quickly could that be? There is a court hearing later this month, but there's always a question with dates in the diary whether that will be the total issue or whether something will roll on. So I can't say yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
One other question about something completely different.
Please go ahead, Councillor Gleeson.
The 3.29, it said about cyber security. You touched on it, said some of it's around training and making sure that staff are very vigilant about that. Is there anything else that you're doing, or potentially you don't know? Can we have feedback about that?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, through you, Chair, I'll say something and Shane might want to supplement. So one of the areas that we needed to address was vigilance around cyber threats in the workforce, and that's been a whole programme of training. Because as some of you will know, the kind of environment within which cyber threats have now become a very real threat to organisations is so sophisticated. There are so many things you've got to be trained on. So it's been a whole programme of different modules online and videos and all sorts we've been put through. And it has been real eye-opener. So the training's been quite a substantial element, but also we're part of an ICT shared service with the other two South Worcestershire councils, and they've put more resource into cyber resilience, and they've undertaken lessons learned from other local authorities and from consultancy, I think the National Cyber Centre, something like that, who've got a sort of resilience role that the government have put in place to sort of help organisations where there is a cyber attack. So we've made the links with that organisation. It's not because we've had a cyber threat, it's because we've understood the threat level in our sector to have been raised significantly. So to try and sum up, lay people like myself have been trained in what we should do to be more vigilant and not bring risk into the council. And then the experts who support our IT systems have also been further trained and also been improving the resilience of our own systems and looking at things like backups and the overlap between all the different systems we use. That's the extent of my technical knowledge. But
Shane, would you like to add anything else to that?
I don't think there's much to add. I mean, that covers it pretty well. What the head of IT has undertaken a series of programs of work and as sort of accreditation as a practitioner in terms of cybersecurity. So that is now becoming part of his job role. We meet monthly as a shared service management board, and there is a standing item on cybersecurity as that. So every month we're going through what steps have we taken lately, what further actions can we take, and all the things that Sean has mentioned are underway in progress. It's always a risk. There's always going to be an element of risk, but one of the principles we recognise is that a threat to this authority is the same as the other two authorities, and so we share that responsibility across the shared service. So there is a bigger pool of knowledge and understanding there in terms of how we can address this particular issue, but something we're going to have to continue to be vigilant about, no doubt.
I just think, yeah, just like to say, I think it's really positive that you are being that vigilant, having worked with some public sector organisations who haven't backed up data and then they've ceased to be able to operate. It's really positive to be able to know that we're actually being ahead of that, and we're not waiting for a definite threat. We just know that other organisations are facing those threats, and we need to do everything we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cookson. Councillor Jagger, please.
You've mentioned that there's been a delay in the publication of the external audit. Would you be able to clarify the reasons for that delay and any risks that we might face due to that delay?
Councillor Jagger, can I please suggest to take it up when we move to the next agenda item? There will be an opportunity to revisit that, if that's okay. Thank you. Any more questions, suggestions, opinions? I do have one, I suppose, comment around 3.8. So the unfortunate incident with the service failure at our car parks. I was wondering about this based on a couple of experiences of delays with the contractors. This is far more severe, and in terms of the impact, affected more local residents and visitors in the city. I was wondering in terms of the procurement framework and the governance in general, what kind of assurances could we provide to members, but also to the general public? I think it's a valid question in terms of public interest.
Thank you, Chair. Do you mean in terms of the supplier that we've now moved to?
Yes,
yes.
A service failure basically, and moving on to someone who we are satisfied will be able to meet the terms and conditions.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, the supplier that we've appointed is Metric, who is one of the largest suppliers of car parking machines up and down the country. We approach this due diligence with a high degree of effort because of our experiences, and as officers we felt very responsible for making the right appointment, as you can probably imagine. So we were able to choose a supplier from a framework agreement, a pre-procured agreement. We did consider doing our own procurement, but we looked at the market and who the suppliers are, and we were satisfied that those appointed to the framework were major mainstream providers of these machines, and that would be a good place from which to make our choice. In terms of selecting our supplier, we had a series of questions that we wanted to establish based on our previous poor experience relating to how the relationship with the merchant card, the merchant bank transaction side of things went, because effectively you have a three-way contract. You have to have a contract with a card payment processor as well. And so from our learnt experience, we had a lot of questions about who would we be dealing with and how would that relationship work. We also wanted to understand what their software looked like, because understanding that the parking team can use the back office software and that they can track faults and see when something's going wrong was really, really important, because there's more power then for the team locally to know if something is going wrong, what to do about it. So we had demonstrations. We also took references and we spoke to people who were using machines, who were happy with them, and that was obviously a very important thing to do. What I would say is those standards of due diligence we had applied previously before we'd appointed our previous supplier being Flowbird, but in the time that we had, the process we'd gone through initially to appoint that previous supplier, their company had been taken over, and significantly the management and the equipment had changed. So again, this time around, we wanted to procure from a supplier who was so established in the market that their credentials were up and down the country, and you could go and see them for yourself. So we wanted that safety and security in that regard. So we were then very detailed about installation and the programme for those works, and we've been monitoring that very closely and having weekly Friday meetings with the supplier as the installation process has progressed.
Thank you very much. Just a quick follow-up on this. There are references to accessibility of our services right across the report, and I was just wondering. It has occurred to me as you were explaining, in terms of people who are happy and confident, comfortable with the digital. What about people who are not comfortable with card payments and sort of digital way of doing things is perhaps not as easy for them as for most of us?
Thank you, Chair. The vast majority of our car parks will take all forms of payment. When we took our proposal through the Policy and Resources Committee to put a new contract in place, Office's proposal was that a small number of car parks would be card only, in order to provide a saving for the council on the car parking machines overall. That's either 4 or 5 car parks from memory, and the data from those showed the low levels of activity in them, which is what led us to conclude that that was a reasonable decision, balancing different considerations. I know it's been the subject of discussion since, you know, I recognise that. But the decision was taken cognizant of the fact that in the vast majority of the council's car parks, you absolutely can pay by cash as well as card.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are no further questions on this agenda item, I propose to move on to, well, no, sorry, before we move on to, we have to formally approve the contents of the report. So if I can ask colleagues to indicate whether they're happy with the content and approval of the annual governance statement 22-23 by raising your hands, please. That is approved unanimously. Thank you. Right, so we are on to the agenda item number 6, external audit and the annual audit letter. Has everybody received the copy of this? Has all the members had a chance to go through the letter, hopefully? I suppose the starting point in my case, before I open the floor to questions and comments, is I think I shared disappointment with the delay with the accounts audit. So that's probably the elephant in the room. But perhaps before we go into the questions and see whether there's any comments. Shane, would you like to add anything in terms of summarizing the findings of the audit report before we take questions?
Thank you, Chair. Certainly, yes. For those who are new to the process, if you're not entirely familiar with the way that local government accounts and audits works, just to run through that, normally we produce draft statements of accounts by the end of May, and then the auditors come along and do their work and publish their final audited accounts by the 30th of September. And we normally have an audit committee at the end of September which receives those, as they're normally done in time. And then this bit, which is the final statement from the auditors, which they would normally present themselves, follows in the December meeting. As you can see, we're a year and a half behind in terms of that cycle, which is entirely due to the audit element of that, because we did publish our draft statement of accounts on time. It's important to remember, though, that in 2021, 1920 and 2021 and 21-22, the rules were relaxed to allow an extra couple of months for this process to take through, so it's not quite as delayed as it might otherwise be. The purpose of this is to conclude the audit, so just to draw your attention to the key elements on page 19 of your papers, which is page 10 of the audit report. That sets out any material differences where the auditors didn't feel that we'd presented the financial statements correctly or taken a different interpretation. And there were 4 items there, 2 of which relate to the COVID-19 grants. So this was obviously a new area. We had a lot of grants coming through the council and being passed on to others in our view, we were acting as a agent of government, and we treated it in that way. In the auditor's view, well, it was actually our income and expenditure, so they asked us to treat it differently. It makes no difference to the accounts at the end of the day, because the net result is the same. But those kind of examples where we've taken a slightly different view as to accounting treatment, so those were all adjusted there. And then one at the bottom, slightly lower down, 393, understatement on the NNDR appeals provision. So every year we set aside a certain amount for businesses who might appeal their national non-domestic rates assessment. And so there's always a possibility they say, well, we shouldn't be paying quite as much as we do. Those are assessed by the valuation office, not ourselves, and they tell us sometime later on whether or not they've been successful. So we always make an allowance for that. And in the auditor's opinion, we should have made a larger allowance, but we took a different accounting treatment, and we believe ours is correct. So we decided we weren't going to adjust our accounts for that, and they've accepted that merely to note it there. So those were the discussions which we had at the last meeting. The auditors took us through those. And then the bit that was remaining was the value for money assessment. So they carry out quite a bit of work, not just in terms of auditing the accounts, but understanding the authority and how we're run, and whether we're meeting our duties under the Best Value Act to pay due regard to economy, efficiency and effectiveness in our services. So the important bit on that is the conclusion, which is that they were quite happy that we complied with that responsibility in full. I won't go through all the details, but in effect, we have a clean audit opinion for 2021. So 21-22, we finally received the audit certificate for this in March. The latest information we have had is that Ernst & Young were planning to do their audit work in the summer, which is as close as they've had to a proposal. Fairly recently, we received a letter, all local authorities received a letter from the department asking us to resolve this problem and work together to reach a conclusion. I wrote to the auditors at that time asking for their input into that process, what their plans are and the timetable. They agreed to arrange a meeting. I said that I've got an audit committee, so I needed an answer more quickly than that, and haven't had a response to that statement. So as things stand, I'm not sure what Ernst & Young's plans are. Some of you will be aware that we are changing auditors. This is part of a national process, so it's not our local decision. The Public Sector Appointments Organisation has found some new auditors for us, and they are due to start work on the current year's accounts. And we have a meeting set up with them later in the month to start off that process. And hopefully they'll belong to the committee before too long to introduce themselves and set out what work they're going to do. But we may be in a position where we are running 3 sets of audits all at the same time, which will be interesting. But I'm happy to take any questions around that or on the audit conclusion itself. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Shane. Councillor Jagger, you had a question. Would you like to follow on with it, or are you satisfied?
I'm satisfied with that response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Councillor Cookson, please.
It's just really to help my understanding. You've got a comment in the report at 3.2 that the predicted fee was going to be 39,000 and the final fee is likely to be agreed is likely to be higher. I just wanted to understand how it works that they get to set their own fees, and it just seems a bit of I'm sure there's an explanation, but it just seems rather odd that they can choose how much we need to pay them. And so how does that work, and how do we go about controlling these costs when we're in a position of very tight budgetary positions? It just seems a little bit strange that auditors can choose what they get paid, or choose what work they do, and therefore they say, we want to do more work. I mean, I work as a consultant. If I went to my client and said, actually, I want to do far more work than you've commissioned me to do, and you're paying me more, they'd all tell me where to go. So how does it work?
Shane, I believe this is part of a broader framework arrangement. So in terms of setting fees, it's not the case of sort of us being fleeced by Ernst & Young. Shane, would you like to say?
It's page 25 in the auditor's report, sets out their planned fee. I'm on for 2021. And normally at this stage, that would be showing their proposed fee, their actual fee that's defined. And you can see that the top of that, there's what's called the audit scale fee. And that's 39,362, and that mentioned in the covering report as well. So that audit scale fee is set by the public sector audit appointments body. So this is a national organisation which arranges the appointments of local government auditors. Now, we don't have to buy into that. We don't buy into it. We don't pay for it. But we don't have to opt into that process. We could set our own auditors if we wanted to. But the value of using the PSAA approach is that they set the audit fee and they have a contract with the auditors. So it's not a contract between the auditors and ourselves. It's between the PSAA. And they let those contracts for 3 years. I think I'm right saying 3 years, for a period of years. And through that process, then the audit body will, if it feels that it's had to carry out work in addition to what's on the scale fee, and that sets out the things that they must do to complete their audit, then they will say, well, we've got additional charges, and they'll present those additional charges to us. We will say, well, okay, some of that's our fault, and it's fair enough that you're charging us extra for that. Some of it may be, we would dispute it and say, well, we think that's within the scale fee, or we don't see why you had to do that extra work, or so on and so forth. So there is a process of negotiation around that. And then in the event that we can't come to a conclusion about what the fee should be, we will then refer to the PSAA, who then make a decision, and they will decide whether or not they accept the auditor's view of the work they did, the council's view, or an alternative position. Okay, so that's ultimately down to them. We've only been through this process once, where there's been no dispute. So in the first year, it was straightforward, it was agreed. The second year, last year, we disputed it, and it went to the PSAA, and in the end, they settled on something which was about 50% between the two. It's more or less agreed, half and half. I think it ended up something around 70,000, I think, from memory. So there is a process. It's quite lengthy. It takes a while, but it is good to have that separate organisation making that decision, because they're looking at it from an objective point of view. And I think that's probably the best way we're going to be able to say, right, well, we'll accept that position, because that's what the PSA has advised us is appropriate fee. So I think last year's process was reasonably successful in that sense, that we weren't, to use the phrase offered, fleeced by the auditors, because we had a third party to say, well, we accept that's reasonable. We don't think that's reasonable, or that should have been included in your scale fee. And so that's how we came to a conclusion.
Thank you very much, Shane. It sounds far more reasonable than my language. So talking about being fleeced. Any other questions? Councillor Lamb, please.
Yeah, it just caught my eye actually. Big page 19 or little page 10 of the auditor's report under audit differences. Just this point here, which has got real topicality again, with the £160,000 overstatement of other creditors, where the county council no longer required support from the city council in relation to the running of libraries. Now, when I was on the train from work today, I responded with a slightly acidic comment to a county council, Worcester County Council Facebook posting about how popular and liked these so-called open libraries are, whatever euphemism they've given to making cuts to local services these days. Obviously, you know, St John's Library in my own ward is under danger now of having its, you know, opening hours close, of being reeled back as a service for the local community. And obviously, we agreed to pay £160,000, which we didn't have to do, from the city council to the county council. It's a county council function. So we offered to pay £160,000 to keep libraries in Worcester going. So, A, why did they not require this money? And secondly, what happened to that money? Did it just sort of vanish back into the account? So why didn't they need the £160,000? Because they're now threatening to close the servers again. And where did the money go?
Shane, would you be happy to take this? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I can't really answer the question as to why the county council decided they didn't need the money. 2 years we set aside the funding, and then the county didn't require it. I think those were through the COVID years, so they received a lot of additional income from government grants, one sort or another, and found that they had sufficient funds to fund the libraries. In the third year, they did require that funding, and they did request it. But what this refers to is creditors that we'd put back in 2021 in the expectation they would want the money. Well, in the end, they didn't want the money, so the money stayed with us and was brought back into our reserves. So it stayed in reserves where it would have come from otherwise. Going forward, so we had a discussion with the county towards the budget setting process last year, and presented the fact that we are in a more difficult financial position than they were at the time, and indicated an intention not to provide that funding, and there was no objection to that. That's as far as I can say, Matt, in terms of how that discussion went. They didn't make any objection to that, so we took it that they didn't require the funding, and it wasn't invoiced. So whether they will revisit that at some point, is a matter for other committee to discuss.
Thank you very much, Shane. Any other questions, comments, observations from members? As everybody's making up their minds, I've got a question of my own, if I may. So the pages 15, 16, which are talking about the risk management and financial resilience. So in terms of the risk register, so would you be able to sort of provide an explanation of what kind of risks in terms of external risks, economic, climate, natural events like flooding, which is a frequent occurrence here in this city? What kind of things are being taken into consideration? I'm asking this as much in the interest of the sort of members' knowledge, but also public knowledge as well. So assessing financial risks to the council, what goes into that process?
Thank you, Chair. Well, there are two levels of risk assessment. There are service level risk assessments. So each of the services has a specific risk register which they manage, and they review that on a quarterly basis. And then there's a corporate risk register. So that consists of items which are considered sufficiently significant on the individual service risk register to be a corporate priority and something that we should pay attention to. And then there's a wide range of risks, and they're not categorized particularly. I mean, they are simply, we have a regular process. I say regular, it's probably quite an irregular process, isn't it, in terms of a senior management team of reviewing the overall risk register, but a fairly frequent process of doing that. And try to identify matters which have come out of the audit governance statement, for example, or out of internal audit reports, or out of the wider environment, which we should be paying attention to. Now, they will generally be part of discussions, particularly for the finance elements around the Policy and Resources Committee, but other matters which come out of committee, which are of significant, and where we think there is a potential impact in the future, which will make it difficult to deliver the policy, or to deliver the services that the council states that it wants to do. So, for example, one of the key priorities stated in terms of the financial position is, are there sufficient resources to deliver the city plan? And so that's not just the financial resources, but also the training and the capacity of staff, an understanding of across the board. So that is reported to Policy and Resources twice a year, the overall risk register, and a summary of the individual service risk registers. And this committee, under the way that we've established our risk management process, receives a report on any changes to the way that we've done that. So any changes to the system of risk assessment. So we'll be bringing a report, because we are now reviewing our corporate risks at the moment, back to the committee at the next meeting to talk about how we've reviewed the risk register this time around.
That is very useful. Thank you very much. Since we've mentioned the internal audit, we are about to move to that agenda item. But before we do that, any more questions in terms of our external audit? And anyone here? Thank you very much. Well, in this case, I'd like to recommend that the external audit letter, and the committee notes the details of the annual audit letter. And if it's okay with everybody, if you raise your hand, if you're happy to note the content of the letter. Thank you very much. As I said, moving on to agenda item 7. Got Helen with us today, an internal audit. So this is going to cover 22-23 and our annual report, which includes the audit opinion and some commentary. Helen, would you be happy to take us through that report, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is the internal audit report for 22-23, and it provides a summary of the activity during that year, the internal audit activity during that year. 22 areas were reviewed and reported on, and this was sufficient coverage for the Chief Internal Auditor to provide an overall opinion. Follow-ups have continued and shown a positive direction of travel. We've also continued the NFI, the National Fraud Initiative oversight, and we also completed a full audit plan for Shropshire and Wrekin Fire and Rescue Service, and they have also contracted for our services for a further year. The appendices provide a more provide breakdown and information for the year. So Appendix 1 indicates that we have delivered what we initially planned to, and Appendix 2 breaks this down further. Appendix 3 summarises the follow-ups that we undertook, and Appendix 4 provides a summary of the audits completed during the 22-23 year, and this was what was used to inform the overall audit opinion. The key message is in Appendix 5, page 49, which is the Chief Internal Auditor's comments and the audit opinion for the year. The audit opinion provides an overall assurance and is summed up in the first paragraph on page 49. We've also included a copy of the Charter, which sets out what we do and how we go about delivering it, and is brought before members on an annual basis. That is basically an overview of the report, Chair.
Thank you very much, Helen. Before we go to I shall start with questions from the floor. I got one question of my own, but in case we have questions, this is really comprehensive again. Thank you very much for your introduction and an overview. If there are no questions at this point, I would like to bring everyone's attention to, I'm just trying to find it in the section on grants. There you go. So 327, so anti-fraud and corruption. Would you be able to provide an explanation of what action was taken in the case of this fraudulent activity? So an attempt to obtain a grant under.
Through you, Chair, the details of the actions that were taken are set out in the confidential appendix. So if you wish to move to a confidential session, then we can talk in more detail.
That would be great. Any other questions at this stage?
Happy to pause it. Yes, please, Margaret.
Thank you. One final question with reference to the annual internal audit report. Do we have any final comments, questions, suggestions? None that I can see, in which case I would like to move to the recommendation that this committee notes the report contents. Everybody in favour, could you please indicate by raising your hands? Thank you very much. That's everyone present. And that rather neatly moves us to any other business. Anyone looking around the room? None seen. Thank you very much. Well, in this case, I would like to conclude this meeting. Wish you all a very good evening and thank you for coming along.